The world expected a song. On that cold November morning in 1963, as Washington, D.C. stood frozen beneath gray skies and lowered flags, the silence felt unnatural, most cruel. Thousands lined the streets. Millions watched through flickering black and white screens. A nation held its breath, waiting for something, anything, to soften the ache that had settled deep into its bones. A voice. A familiar one. A voice that had once carried laughter into smoky clubs, comfort into living rooms, and warmth into broken hearts. Dean Martin. But the voice never came. And the silence that followed would become one of the most misunderstood moments in American cultural history. Years later, people would whisper theories. Some would accuse him of arrogance. Others called it disrespect. A few even claimed fear, politics, or hidden grudges. But none of them knew the truth. Because the real reason Dean Martin refused to sing at JFK's funeral had nothing to do with ego, and everything to do with loyalty, grief, and a promise he never broke. The day America stopped breathing, November 22, 1963, didn't arrive loudly. It crept in like an ordinary Friday till it wasn't. News bulletins interrupted radio programs. Television anchors struggled to keep their composure. Secretaries cried at their desks. Factory floors fell silent. Children came home early from school, confused by the way adults suddenly moved slower, spoke softer, and stared at nothing. A young president was gone. Not just a leader, but a symbol. Youth, hope, possibility. The funeral was planned with historic weight. Every detail mattered. Every sound would be remembered. Every absence would be noticed. And so, when organizers began listing those who might honor the fallen president, one name appeared again and again. Dean Martin. He wasn't just a singer. He was a cultural constant. A man whose voice had soothed post-war America, whose humor had made people forget their worries, if only for a while. Too many, his presence felt obvious. Necessary? The nation didn't just want music. It wanted familiarity. It wanted comfort. It wanted to feel whole again, if it briefly. And Dean Martin seemed like the perfect answer. A call that should have been easy, the request came quietly. No pressure, no headlines, no demands. Just a respectful invitation to sing. Those close to Dean expected a quick yes. Why wouldn't he? This was history. This was legacy. This was a moment that would echo for generations. But when Dean heard the words, something inside him tightened. He didn't respond right away. He didn't joke. He didn't deflect. He just sat there silent. Those who knew him well recognized that look. The one he got when humor failed him, when charm didn't feel appropriate, when the weight of something too heavy pressed down on his chest. Hours passed. Then came his answer. No. Just one word. Firm, calm, final. The room went quiet. Someone asked if he needed time. Another suggested a different song. Dean shook his head. I can't. And that was all he said. The world reacts without knowing why the decision didn't stay private for long. In times of national mourning, even silence becomes news. Whispers turned into questions. Questions turned into judgments. Why would someone refuse such an honor? Some said he thought himself above it. Others claimed he didn't care. A few hinted at politics' dangerous assumptions made without evidence. The truth was simpler and far more painful. Dean Martin wasn't avoiding the moment. He was drowning in it. Behind the smile everyone thought they knew to the public, Dean Martin was effortless. Smooth voice, relaxed posture. A man who looked like life never touched him too deeply. But that image was only half the story. Behind closed doors, Dean was different, quiet, observant, loyal to a fault. He carried grief the way some men carry secrets never spoken, always present. He had buried people he loved. He had watched friendships fracture. He had learned that sometimes performing through pain wasn't strength, it was surrender. And on this day, surrender wasn't something he could do. Not here, not now. Because singing at that funeral would have meant breaking something sacred, a line he had drawn long before the cameras ever rolled. A promise made in private years earlier. Far from microphones and applause, Dean had made a promise. Not to the public, not to history, but to a man whose name never appeared in headlines. A promise about grief, about boundaries, about never turning loss into performance. It wasn't written down. It wasn't recorded, but it was absolute. And as the nation prepared to mourn its president, Dean found himself standing at the edge of that promise, knowing full well what refusing would cost him. Criticism, misunderstanding, permanent speculation. But some promises don't exist to be convenient. They exist to be kept. The silence that hurt more than words on the day of the funeral, when the expected song never arrived. Many felt something missing. They didn't know what. They just knew it hurt. Dean watched from afar. No interviews, no statements, no defenses. He let the silence speak for him, because explaining would have meant revealing something he never intended the world to know. And as the coffin moved slowly forward, as the bells rang, as history etched itself into memory, Dean Martin mourned in his own way. Not with music, but with restraint, with loyalty. With a quiet pain the world mistook for indifference. What no one understood, years would pass before fragments of the truth surfaced. Before close friends spoke in careful sentences. Before historians stopped guessing and started listening. Before people realized that refusing to sing wasn't an act of disrespect, it was an act of devotion, to grief, to memory, to a promise that mattered more than applause. And in the end, Dean Martin didn't dishonor the moment, he protected it. Dean Martin had learned long ago that the most dangerous promises were the quiet ones. Not the kind made on stages or in front of witnesses. Not the kind written in ink or sealed with handshakes. The dangerous ones were whispered, made in rooms where grief still lingered in the air, where voices trembled, and where breaking them would feel like betrayal of the self. This promise had been made on a night Dean never spoke about publicly. A night that returned to him now with brutal clarity. The night that changed everything. It was years before the funeral. Years before the world expected Dean Martin to be the voice of comfort for a grieving nation. That night had no audience, no spotlight. Just two men sitting in a dimly lit room, the kind where time feels slower and words matter more. One of them was Dean. The other was a man dying, not from bullets, not from politics, but from something quieter and crueler. Loss. The man had lost his son, a young man with a future that never arrived. There had been a funeral. There had been hymns. There had been applause for the singer, who performed beautifully while the father stood frozen beside the coffin. And afterward, in private, the man broke. He looked at Dean and said something Dean would never forget. They sang perfectly, but I couldn't hear a word. Dean didn't respond. He knew that kind of pain, the kind that makes sound meaningless. The man continued, his voice hollow. Some grief isn't meant to be carried by music. Some moments should stay silent. That was when the promise was made. Dean promised that if he ever felt music would turn loss into spectacle, if singing would cheapen grief instead of honoring it, he would refuse, no matter who asked, no matter the consequences, no matter how misunderstood he became. Dean thought he'd never be tested like that. He was wrong. When the past collided with history as news of President Kennedy's assassination spread, Dean felt something shift inside him. It wasn't political, Achaia. It wasn't fear. It was recognition, the kind that tightens the chest and makes memories resurface without warning. He watched the footage like everyone else, the motorcade, the sudden chaos, the stillness afterward. And then he saw the faces. Jacqueline Kennedy, the children. The people who loved a man the world only thought it knew. That was when the promise returned sharp and unforgiving. This wasn't just a public tragedy. This was private grief unfolding on a global stage. And Dean knew something most people didn't understand. When grief becomes performance, the people suffering most are often the ones least heard. The pressure no one saw as the days passed, the pressure grew quietly. Not from headlines, from people who meant well. Advisors, friends, industry figures. They told him it would be healing. They said it would bring unity. They insisted the country needed his voice. Dean listened, and every word felt heavier than the last. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. Because how do you explain a promise rooted in someone else's pain? How do you say, if I sing, I will betray something sacred? Instead, he said nothing. And silence, as always, invited interpretation. The false narratives begin speculation filled the vacuum. Some claimed Dean was afraid of controversy. Others said he didn't respect the office. A few suggested personal grudges that never existed. What hurt most wasn't the accusations. It was knowing that if he spoke the truth, he would expose a grieving father who never asked to be remembered. Dean chose to absorb the blame. He had done it before. He would do it again. Alone with the weight of his choice the night before the funeral, Dean couldn't sleep. He sat in his home, lights low, television muted, watching images of crowds gathering in Washington. He imagined what it would be like to stand there, to open his mouth, to let his voice float above the tears. And suddenly he felt sick. Not from nerves, from certainty. He realized something that startled even him. If he sang, he wouldn't be honoring the dead. He would be protecting the living from silence. And that wasn't his right. Grief, he believed, deserved space, not polish. Not perfection, not applause. The call he almost answered late that night, the phone rang again. A final check-in. A final chance to change his mind. Dean picked up the receiver. For a moment, he almost said yes. Not because he wanted to, but because he knew how much easier it would be. One song. One appearance. One moment of approval. Instead, he closed his eyes and remembered the father's words. I couldn't hear a word. Dean exhaled and quietly said no. The morning of the funeral, as the funeral began, Dean stayed away from radios and televisions, not out of guilt, out of respect. He dressed simply. No suit, no mirror. He sat alone and allowed himself something he rarely did. He cried, not as a celebrity, not as a symbol, but as a man who understood that some losses leave music behind. The world misunderstands again. The absence was noticed immediately. Commentators speculated, viewers questioned. Some felt disappointed, others angry. No one asked the right question. Not, why didn't he sing? But, what did it cost him not to? Dean paid that cost silently. Because some decisions aren't about how you're remembered, they're about who you remain. A truth still hidden, what the world didn't know, what even his closest fans couldn't imagine, was that Dean Martin didn't refuse to sing because he lacked respect. He refused because he had too much. And the most powerful tribute he could offer wasn't his voice. It was restraint. For years, the truth stayed buried not because it was forgotten, but because it was protected. Dean Martin never corrected the rumors, never defended himself, never offered a single sentence to soften public judgment. People assumed that meant he didn't care. They were wrong. Dean cared so deeply that speaking felt like betrayal. But time has a way of loosening even the tightest secrets. And sometimes, the truth chooses its own moment to surface. The envelope that changed everything, it arrived without warning. No return address, no explanation. Just an old cream-colored envelope slipped quietly into Dean's mailbox one ordinary afternoon. He almost ignored it, but something about the handwriting made his chest tighten. 'Twas careful, uneven, written by a hand that trembled not from fear, but from age. Hush. Dean stood there longer than he meant to, the envelope unopened, as if opening it might pull something back into the world that he had worked so hard to keep still. Finally, he went inside. He sat down and opened it. A voice from the past, the letter was short, painfully short. But every word carried weight. You kept your promise. I never thanked you. I am sorry I did not speak sooner. Dean stopped reading. His hands shook. He knew immediately who it was from. The father, the man whose grief had shaped his silence. The man whose pain had unknowingly collided with history. Dean continued. I watched the funeral on television. When they announced you would not sing, people around me were angry. I was not. For the first time, I felt understood. Dean closed his eyes. The room felt smaller. He had never told anyone how close he came to breaking that promise. Never admitted how much the decision had cost him. And yet here was proof that the silence had mattered. The part no one ever knew, the letter continued. You did something rare. You protected grief from being consumed. I wish the world knew why. That line hit Dean harder than anything else. Because the world didn't know. And because the world wasn't supposed to. Dean had believed that protecting the promise meant protecting the silence forever. But now, for the first time, he wondered, was silence still the right choice? Or had it become another kind of harm? The guilt he never shared that night, Dean poured himself a drink and didn't touch it. He sat alone, thinking about all the people who had judged him without knowing the truth. The letters he'd received, the criticism, the quiet distancing by colleagues who didn't understand. He had accepted it all willingly, but something inside him shifted as he reread the letter. Not anger, responsibility. What if his silence had allowed something worse to grow? What if people had learned the wrong lesson? Instead of understanding respect, they saw indifference. Instead of dignity, they saw arrogance. Dean had protected one man's grief, but had he failed the many? Decision he never planned to make. For days, Dean wrestled with the question. He wasn't afraid of the truth. He was afraid of what the truth would expose. Not about himself, but about grief itself. If he spoke, people might misunderstand again. They might twist the story. They might turn pain into headlines. But if he didn't speak, the silence would keep lying for him. And Dean had always hated laissez-faire comfortable ones. The unexpected visit, before he could decide, fate intervened. There was a knock at his door. Not loud, not urgent, just patient. When Dean opened it, he froze. Standing there was the father. Older now, thinner, his eyes carried years of quiet survival. Neither man spoke at first. Then the father said softly, I'm sorry I came without calling. Dean stepped aside. No, he said. I'm glad you did. Two men, one shared silence, they sat across from each other, the letter between them on the table. The father broke the quiet. They blamed you, he said. Dean nodded. I know. I wanted to stop it. Dean looked up. Why didn't you? The father's answer was honest. Because I thought you wanted the silence? Dean swallowed. So did I, he admitted. At first, the father leaned forward. Grief doesn't stay the same forever, he said. Neither should truth. That sentence landed harder than applause ever could. The choice that terrified him most that night, after the father left, Dean knew what he had to do. Not a press conference. Not an interview tour. Not a performance. Something smaller. Something human. Something that wouldn't turn grief into spectacle. He would write one letter. Not to justify himself. Not to clear his name. But to explain why silence can sometimes be the deepest form of respect. And why choosing not to sing can be braver than standing under a spotlight. The risk of being understood, Dean knew the risks. Once the truth was out, it could never be taken back. People might still judge him. They might say it was too little, too late. But for the first time since the funeral, Dean felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Peace, because the truth was no longer trapped inside him. It was finally ready to breathe. What comes next? The letter would be published quietly. No headlines, screaming accusations, no sensational claims. Just a man explaining why he chose silence over sound. And when people finally read it, the story would change forever. Dean Martin never planned for the letter to change history. He wrote it at a small desk near a window, early in the morning, when the world was quiet enough to feel honest. No assistants, no advisors, no drafts meant for approval. Just truth. He didn't polish it to sound noble. He didn't frame himself as misunderstood. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply explained why he had stayed silent when the world expected him to sing. And when the letter was released, it didn't explode. It didn't trend. It didn't dominate headlines. At first, it barely moved. The letter that didn't shout. The letter appeared quietly in a respected publication, no dramatic title, no sensational framing. Just a man explaining grief. He wrote about promises, about a father who couldn't hear music through loss, about the difference between honoring pain and decorating it. He wrote one line that stopped readers cold. There are moments when adding beauty does not heal, it distracts, and grief deserves better than distraction. That sentence traveled slowly from one reader to another, from kitchen tables to classrooms, from private conversations to public reflection. And something rare began to happen. People stopped arguing. They started listening. The shift no one expected at first. Reactions were mixed. Some still disagreed. Some said he should have sung anyway. Others felt conflicted. But very few dismissed him anymore. Because Dean wasn't defending himself, he was explaining a principle. That silence can be an act of respect. That restraint can be a form of love. That not every moment needs a soundtrack. The narrative shifted not overnight, but steadily. Commentators revisited old footage with new eyes. Journalists corrected past assumptions. Even critics softened their tone. What once looked like absence now felt intentional, meaningful, human. The father steps forward. Once, 1 week after the letter's publication, something else happened. The father, the man whose grief had shaped everything, spoke publicly for the first and only time. No interviews, no book deals, just a short statement read by someone else. It said, "Dean Martin did not sing for my son's funeral, and that silence saved me." When he chose silence again, years later, he honored not only a president, but every family whose grief is too heavy for music. That was it. No name, no details. And somehow, that made it more powerful. A nation rethinks what tribute means. People began to talk differently about mourning. Not louder, deeper. Teachers discussed it in classrooms. A clergy referenced it in sermons. Families reconsidered how they honored loss. Dean Martin never intended to start a movement. But he reminded people of something ancient and easily forgotten. Grief isn't a performance. It doesn't need perfection. It doesn't need applause. Sometimes it only needs space. The last conversation months later, Dean and the father met one final time. No cameras, no letters afterward. Just two men sitting together, older now, quieter. "You paid a price," the father said. Dean nodded. "I knew I would." "Would you do it again?" Dean didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Yes." Even knowing everything, the father smiled faintly. Then it was worth it. They shook hands, and that chapter closed. How Dean Martin was finally remembered years later when historians spoke about that funeral. They no longer asked why Dean Martin didn't sing. They asked what it meant that he didn't. They spoke of restraint, of dignity, of choosing principle over approval. And in a strange way, Dean's silence became one of the loudest moments of his life. Not because it demanded attention, but because it taught something enduring. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer the world is not your voice, but your respect. The final truth: Dean Martin didn't refuse to sing because he lacked compassion. He refused because he understood it. And in doing so, he left behind something far greater than a song. He left behind a reminder that silence, when chosen with love, can echo longer than music ever could.